It's time now for World View. On Thursday, the United Nations Human Rights Council will elect 14 new members. Up for election and likely to gain places on the council are, among others, Qatar, Belarus, Egypt and Angola. These are all countries with long records of human rights transgressions. Is it business as usual for human rights in the UN? In March 2006, after devastating criticism from Kofi Annan and others, the General Assembly of the UN voted overwhelmingly to scrap the Human Rights Commission and replace it with the Human Rights Council. Hopes were high at the time that the new body would become an effective advocate on human rights and call to account those responsible for government-sponsored violence. Well, how is the new body faring? A keen observer of both the Commission and the Council is Hillel Neuer. He is the Executive Director of UN Watch, and I spoke to him about the Council recently, and I began by asking him if he believed the Council was an improvement on the Commission.
It's not. It's a great disappointment, actually, for all of us human rights advocates here in Geneva and around the world who had the hope that Kofi Annan's dream, because this all began with Kofi Annan setting forth his vision 2 years ago, his blueprint for reform, and it was one where we'd have a body that would actually look at all countries equally, where members would be countries that promote human rights and don't seek membership to shield their own records of abuse. This was all Kofi Annan's vision, having determined that the Commission was, quote, casting a shadow upon the reputation of the UN as a whole. And the Council was meant to improve on those things, to have countries that cared about human rights and that would strengthen mechanisms to scrutinize governments that abuse human rights, and all governments do in varying degrees. And what we're seeing so far after 1 year is really the opposite of what we all hoped. So it's really a great disappointment.
Do you see a pattern developing that makes you nervous about the future of the Council?
Nervous is putting it mildly. I think human rights groups are sounding out an SOS on the direction of the Council, and there are several reasons for that. It's true it's not over. This year is the year of transition. It's a year where the countries are working on new institutions, new mechanisms for the Council. And we'll see in June when all of the working groups who've been plotting out the different pieces of the new council will get together and meet. But those of us who've been following it, we know what the proposals are, where things stand. On in almost every area, things are looking very grim. But I agree, we need to look in June and see where we stand. But currently, you have leading human rights groups, including UN Watch, sounding an alarm. For example, the country rapporteurs. They're the investigators on abuses in Sudan or Haiti or Cambodia. They're called the crown jewels of the Human Rights Council because they are independent. They're not relying on governments to vote one way or the other. They can expose abuses, and many of them are on the chopping block. These are the crown jewels of the Council.
What about the actual structure of the Council? Does it need to be rethought, this issue of quotas from continents, pretty much as it stands? I think it's 13 from Asia, 13 from Africa. How, by still maintaining the UN's Charter to be representative of all nations, how do you structure a Council in such a way that it's not going to be open to the kinds of abuse you claim we've seen?
It's one of the dilemmas of the United Nations. The United Nations is a combination of idealism and realism. If we want a UN that will be effective and credible, it has to reflect the countries that are in the world, as well as the powers that exist. And after the Second World War, the great powers were the victors over Nazi Germany, Russia, the United States, France, the UK, and as well as China, a leading power at that time. So the UN reflects the powers that be, as well as idealism, because the UN Charter, as you rightly mentioned, speaks about human rights, putting an end to the scourge of war. And so the Human Rights Council as well, it's founded on great rhetoric of principles that we all hold dear of basic individual rights, but it also reflects the reality, and the reality is there are certain countries in the world that are not proponents of strong scrutiny of abuses, and that's something we can't really get around. So, for example, in Africa, most countries see scrutiny of human rights records as a Western exercise to embarrass former colonies. And many of them, as a matter of principle, oppose any scrutiny of human rights whatsoever. And so they oppose the notion of country rapporteurs. They oppose resolutions that would ever name Sudan as a matter of principle. And in fact, the majority of countries at the United Nations oppose human rights mechanisms that name specific countries. And how do you get around that? How do you have a body that is universal and yet includes countries that care about human rights? Well, we're trying our best. So in Africa, there's going to be elections in May, and I'll actually be flying to the UN in New York together with Freedom House to give our endorsements of the countries that should be elected and not. A third are going to be up for election. And so in Africa, if we can pick between South Africa and Sudan, we pick South Africa. South Africa is a democracy. The problem is South Africa very much follows the line that this is sort of a Western exercise to scrutinize countries. And so South Africa, at the Security Council and at the Human Rights Council here in Geneva, votes consistently against any attempt to scrutinize, be it Myanmar, formerly known as Burma, to speak out for Aung San Suu Kyi, who's under house arrest. South Africa says, we shouldn't embarrass countries. We shouldn't name countries. Of course, there are exceptions when it comes to Israel. The Arab-sponsored resolutions are all supported by the countries who say we shouldn't name and shame, but they do it on Israel, and that's, of course, a well-known anomaly that Kofi Annan has spoken about quite a deal.
Okay, well, I guess we might as well talk about this issue of Israel because it's important. What is it about the structure of the Council that it's able to come up with continued condemnations of Israel and Israel's behaviour?
Well, it's one of the greatest obstacles to the credibility of the Council, as Kofi Annan said, is the fact that only a handful of countries, or sometimes just one country, is singled out, and 191 or 192 others are ignored. And this was the politicization that the Council spoke about. And Israel, of course, is the classic example. This year at the Council, there have only been 9 condemnations of a specific country, and 9 out of 9 times it's been Israel. Israel should be scrutinized. There are violations there, and Israel has to be held accountable to the roadmap and to allow a Palestinian state. But to adopt such an extreme one-sided approach that gives impunity and immunity to Hamas and Hezbollah, to terrorists, is wrong and it's counterproductive. And why does it happen? Well, the Arab states since 1975 have led a determined campaign to delegitimize Israel. It was Zionism is racism, which Kofi Annan called the low point of anti-Semitism at the United Nations. And they adopted that resolution in 75. It was since repealed 16 years later. But in every other forum, because of the numbers game, and we'll get to that in a second, the Arab League could introduce a resolution saying that the earth is flat, and it would pass with a huge majority, especially if the earth is flat in Israel. And so what you have here at the Human Rights Council is one time after another, the Arab League, and together with the Islamic group, has significant power. They have over a third of the seats at the council, and they are immediately supported by an array of repressive regimes, including China, Russia, Cuba, Zimbabwe, Sudan, immediately support any resolution whatsoever before they even see it. And then you have other countries in South America, democracies, who don't normally support these sorts of things, but in recent years are coming under pressure at the UN. It's all a numbers game. We vote for you, you vote for us. So if the Islamic group has 56 votes, and they'll vote for Russia, so that Russia won't be condemned on its violations in Chechnya, where hundreds of thousands have been killed, and the Islamic group says nothing on Russia on that issue, even though the Chechens are Muslims. And so there's a very cynical deal happening here, and happens every day. And if you have a determined group that is willing to trade votes to get what it wants, and it has a quarter of the seats at the UN, it can get whatever it wants. And that's the reality, and it has nothing to do really with principles. It's all about politics. And that's very depressing for human rights activists.
You're listening to World View and a conversation with Hillel Neuer. He's the Executive Director of UN Watch. We'll return after the break with a look at the nature of UN Watch, what is it, and also Mr. Neuer's view of the future of the Council.